Hi everyone, I know this is kind of a different way to do class today, especially on our day that we are bringing Green Day students together with White Day students, but I wanted to make sure that you still were able to do the work we would have done in class and the work that some of my other students are doing, even though I'm not here today. So I'm going to do a quick video and I'm going to have some links in the Edpuzzle for you to go to, and you should fill out your page, your note sheet that you picked up in the classroom. So today what our focus is what happened after World War II. So when World War II ended, the conflict didn't end. So I know that probably doesn't surprise you. After the end of World War I led to the conflict of World War II, but the end of World War II leads to a new conflict called the Cold War. So that's what today is going to be about. And so this first slide will just give you a visual understanding. I'll move my picture here. A visual understanding of where the Cold War takes place in US history. So I've kind of moved my picture around here. I think maybe this will be the best place for it. So you can see some of the major events we covered in class, and notice how huge the Cold War is in reference to the decades across the 20th century. So you can see after World War II ends, the Cold War extends from the end of World War II on into 1991. So it lasts decades. So to start with, I want you to think about what is the Cold War, and maybe you have some information already in your mind. You might have some background knowledge about what you think the Cold War is. But what I want you to do is I want you to take a second, and I know you're not going to be crumpling up a ball. My students in the classroom, when I'm there, will be doing that, but you're going to type it into the Edpuzzle box. So the Cold War wasn't actually cold. I think that's probably the biggest misunderstanding about what the Cold War is. The Cold War was called the Cold War because of its lack of combat. And so it was full of conflict, but not combat between the US and the Soviet Union. And so it's going to be decades of tension that is cold. So it never actually results in full-on conflict and or combat between the US and the Soviet Union. So you can see in this map, it kind of shows how there are these like moments where the US and the Soviet Union go head to head. And so the Cold War was considered cold because the US and the Soviet Union never fought each other, but had huge tensions for decades. However, there were places all around the globe where the war actually got hot, where combat did happen, but it wasn't the United States versus the Soviet Union. It was like puppet fights. And so it's like they were able to fight one another through other countries. And so those were some places that we'll learn about throughout this unit where the Cold War got hot. So let's go ahead and start with what happened when World War II ended. So on this slide, I am going to have you pause the video. I have a link in the Edpuzzle notes on the side, and I want you to watch this video about what happened to the World War II allies when the war ended. So on this slide, you can see this is Germany after World War II. So I'm going to move my picture around a little bit so you can see everything that's going on and all the captions. But when World War II ended, the major nations of the Allied powers, the United States, the Soviet Union, Great Britain, and France came together in a place called Potsdam in Germany. They knew at this point in the war that Germany was going to surrender, and so they came together to decide what to do with Germany. How will they rebuild? And part of their discussion was they wanted to figure out how to stabilize Germany. And so the Nazi regime would no longer be in power, and how do they how do they work together as a group of victors to try to help Germany rebuild? So you can see, and I'll move my picture around, but all four of the nations who defeated Germany, the Soviet Union, the British, the French, and the Americans, took occupied zones. So I'll move my picture up here so you can, on your page, you can color in matching sides. So if you would go ahead and label the different places that were occupied in Germany by the different powers, and then go ahead and color them a different color so that you can see that the British took over this northwestern part of Germany to stabilize and rebuild. The French took over this southwestern portion, the Americans took over the southeastern portion, and then the Soviets took over this region that was very close to where the Soviet Union was. But I want you to notice here, before you color in the Soviet side, they actually decided to do the same thing with the capital of Berlin. So the powers, the British, the French, and the Americans were a little uneasy letting Joseph Stalin completely have the whole capital city, because the capital city of Berlin was inside of the Soviet occupied zone. And so what they did was they decided it would be more equitable to have each power, the Americans, the British, the French, and the Soviets, to all have their own piece of the capital. So that's why you can see the capital has more than just red there. It's also yellow and green and blue to represent the British zone of the capital and the French zone of the capital and the American zone of the capital. But the intention was to allow Germany to be rebuilt, to stabilize the economy, and then allow for Germany to be a freed nation again. However, that did not work as planned. So in 1948, when the process was over and Germany was considered free to be a reestablished democracy, the French and the British and the Americans left their zone free and left and stabilized, and the Soviet Union remained. And so you can see that the zones that were once the French, the Americans, and the British have now become West Germany, and the Soviets didn't leave. So you can see that they have kept their section. This section maintained under the rule of Joseph Stalin, and he did not release his section. So you can see the same thing happened to the capital of Berlin. So this is where West Germany and East Germany came from. On your map, on your paper, I want you to go ahead and use a color to color in West Germany, a color to color in East Germany. I want you to label them. And then can you also color in Berlin? So make sure you have this section, this west side of this capital city was this free side that the French and the British and the Americans left to allow to become a free nation. But since the Soviets didn't leave this section, it was like this little isolated portion of West Germany that's now here in West Berlin. Next is a really important piece to what's going to lead into the Cold War. So you can see that this is Winston Churchill. Winston Churchill in 1946, he leaves Great Britain to come to the U.S. to give the U.S. a message of basically fear. He was very, very concerned about the Soviets and their communist rule. Even though Joseph Stalin was once their ally, he was very, very concerned. So he comes to the US, and on this next slide, I'm going to have you pause, and I want you to click the link, and I'd like you to watch this video about Winston Churchill's speech. So Winston Churchill, he actually came to Fulton, Missouri, and gave his very famous Iron Curtain speech. And this is an image that shows you what this looked like. Now, it was a metaphor. So the Iron Curtain wasn't a real wall, but he said it was as if an Iron Curtain has come down and separated free democracy from everyone living under the rule and control of communism. And so you can see here's Germany just split in half, metaphorically, by this Iron Curtain. So what you can see on this map is kind of a better version. You can see the red represented by communism over here and the blue by democracy. And Germany really, really is split there right down the center of, we've got this blue area split right over here, this red area. Germany on one side is with the other Western countries over here in a democracy where people have free elections. And over here, we have East Germany that is under the rule of Joseph Stalin in this communist country. So what we're going to see with the Cold War is it's this tension between democracies and communism. And the United States is going to be on this side of wanting to spread and support democracies around the world. And The Soviet Union, on the other side, is wanting to spread and support communisms across the globe. And so this tension is what is going to lead to the Cold War, this tension between the US and the Soviet Union that's not actually fighting one another, but an intense competition. So one of the ways, and I know my picture's in the way here, let me move this up a little bit. One of the ways the United States starts to combat communism, and again, it's not the same as a full-on war, but the United States tries to contain communism and stop it from spreading. So the Truman Doctrine was a government law that went into play by Harry S. Truman, and he signed the Truman Doctrine that basically said the U.S. would send troops and military anywhere across the globe that democracy was at stake. And so the Soviet Union did a really similar thing. Anywhere communism was possibly at stake, they would send troops there. So it ended up being these puppet fights in other places around the world where a possibility of a country being taken over by communism, we would, as the United States, would send troops and military there to go support that nation. And one of those places was Greece and Turkey. President Truman sent $400 million in military aid and support to under the Truman Doctrine to try to keep these countries from falling to communism. The next slide is another way that the United States tried to combat communism from spreading, and it was by sending money. So the Marshall Plan was another government law or document that basically made it just a federal action to send money across the globe. So I think of Truman troops, Marshall money. So the Marshall Plan sent money all across the globe. Anywhere where the economies were weak, the United States sent money to try to help sustain those nations so that they would not want to have a strong government come in. So you can see on this chart, if you want to stop and look and just see how much money was sent to different nations. I'll also move my picture over here and I'll show you this is also another chart in map form that shows you where a lot of the money went to try to help sustain and stabilize these nations. So here's the first conflict of the Cold War, and this is where it gets a little warm. So the first conflict happens in Berlin. So remember, Berlin is the capital city of Germany, but it is inside of East Germany that is controlled by the Soviet Union. But then there's this little tiny portion of Berlin that is the free part that is connected to West Germany over here. And so what happens is Joseph Stalin wants to take over that section and he creates a blockade. So there's no transportation coming in, there's no support coming in, and so his hope is to starve off the people living in West Berlin. And so that blockade makes it to where they have to either give in to Stalin and say, we want your support, or starve, because there is no food or supply transportations allowed in. There's checkpoints all across between the borders of East and West Germany, and so there will be no supplies moving into the capital from the West. And so his hope is to basically get them to surrender to him and to his control. And so what I'd like for you to do is I'd like for you to watch this video on the next slide, and what you'll need to do is just click the link in the Edpuzzle notes on the side so that you can answer a few questions about the Berlin blockade and airlift. So finally, on this slide, you have a world map where you can see the blues and the reds that represent the countries that are in alliances during the Cold War, and it's based on governing systems. So NATO is the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, and the Warsaw Pact are countries who are united under communism. And so what I'd like for you to do on your map is I'd like for you to color in. Yours is just of Europe, and you might even need to do a Google search so that you can see more closely which countries under the Cold War were with NATO and which were with the Warsaw Pact. If you have a blue, you can color the democracies blue, and if you have a red, you can color the communist countries red to show the divide between communism and democracies during the Cold War. All right, lastly, what I'm going to do at the end of each class period is ask you about whether you think conflicts are hot or cold. And so they're progressively going to get a little bit warmer as we move through the Cold War, but I want you to think about these two conflicts, and I want you to answer the question if you